And joining us now is Lisa Graves, the Executive Director of the new corporate watchdog group True North Research. She has served as a senior advisor in all three branches of the federal government, as Deputy Assistant Attorney General in the Justice Department, as Chief Counsel for Nominations on the Senate Judiciary Committee, and as a Deputy Chief of the Article 3 Judges Division for the U.S. Courts. And she has a report at In the Public Interest, the billionaire behind efforts to kill the U.S. Postal Service, and an article at Common Dreams, 12 years after Citizens United, the Supreme Court's right-wing revolution continues. Welcome to Background Briefing, Lisa Graves.
Thank you so much, Ian. It's a joy to be on your show.
Well, thanks for joining us. And the disastrous decision by the Supreme Court in Citizens United still haunts us today. 12 years later, we're on the anniversary of the 12th year of this crippling decision that has had such toxic effects on our politics. And we, of course, couldn't have a more divisive and deadly situation now as we head towards a kind of one-party Republican state controlled by Donald Trump. It's a complete nightmare, and it would not have happened without the enormous power of the plutocracy that this Citizens United ruling enabled. But let's talk about some of the more outrageous stuff that's happening on the Supreme Court itself before we get into talking about your article, Common Dreams, Lisa. First of all, we've learned that Justice Neil Gorsuch refuses to wear a mask, and he does so clearly and brazenly, and his seat on the bench is right next to Justice Sotomayor, who has diabetes, and she now doesn't join the bench. She has to argue from her chambers. And then the oldest serving member of the Supreme Court, Clarence Thomas, he was the one lone dissent in an 8-1 decision that just came down, allowing the National Archives to release papers from the Trump administration that have been requested by the House Select Committee investigating January the 6th. The fact that anybody would have dissented in such a straightforward case is pretty shocking. So what do you make of, I'm just looking at a Newsweek article, there's a lot of calls for Thomas's resignation flashing around on the internet. So what can be done about this man who's so out of touch?
Well, Clarence Thomas is someone who obviously never should have been confirmed to the Supreme Court in the first place. And he's someone who has a very troubling track record. As I point out in my article on Common Dreams, Charles Koch in 2010, the year that the Citizens United decision was issued, sent out an invitation, a private invitation to his network of billionaires, bragging that Justice Thomas had been featured, those are Charles Koch's words, featured at his annual donor political soirees where he coordinates with these fellow billionaires on their political strategy to, capture Congress and other public offices. And Thomas denied it, claiming he just happened to drop by, that his wife was there. That's not what Charles Koch wrote in his letter. And Charles Koch also wrote that Scalia had also been featured at his events. So you have a Supreme Court justice who has been very close to billionaires, not just Koch, also Harlan Crow, who has provided Thomas with yachts and private planes for his travels under the guise of being his friend, a friend that Thomas met when he was on the bench as a judge. So a very friendly billionaire to have at your disposal to provide you with free vacations and the like. I think Thomas is corrupt. I think he should be removed. I think he should resign. I also think that, it's not just Clarence Thomas, it's Ginny Thomas, who has been embroiled in scandal after scandal, where she's been, closely coordinating with the Trump White House, closely coordinating with Republicans in Congress. It's been reported in a number of different places, and I'm sure there's more to that. But she's someone who's an extreme partisan and has also been, very close to Leonard Leo, the guy who has helped pack the bench with his secret dark money network, a network that has been funded by anonymous billionaires, but also including Charles Koch, to basically pack our Supreme Court with the Trump justices who are unworthy of these positions of trust, one of whom, as you mentioned, Ian, is Neil Gorsuch, who is not just a right-winger since his youth, an extreme right-winger who thought his right-wing mother wasn't right-wing enough, but he also appears to be a selfish cad. I would call Gorsuch supremely selfish, for refusing to wear a mask at the court's arguments. And he's also someone who has, continued to advance a right-wing agenda, the agenda of Leonard Leo and the billionaires that have backed him to reverse legal precedents that Americans rely upon for their freedoms.
Well, I recall the frozen truck driver case that came up during his confirmation, where he was the only justice on the appeals court bench to basically rule that the truck driver whose rig broke down in a winter blizzard should have stayed with his rig and frozen to death, as opposed to leaving the rig and going to seek health. And that was such a cruel and heartless ruling. But he was auditioning for the Supreme Court, and you've got this cruel and heartless guy on there, and you mentioned the appalling hearings for the confirmation of Clarence Thomas, where Joe Biden dropped the ball. And then you go back to the other hearings for all of them, in fact, including Roberts himself. Roberts was, of course, a long-time Republican political activist whose entire political career was devoted to stopping Democrats from voting. Surprise, surprise that he struck down Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. I'm bringing this up, Lisa, because these hearings are absolutely useless. We don't learn about who these people are. We learned about who Kavanaugh is, but it didn't sway the majority on the Senate.
When I was working for the Senate Judiciary Committee for Senator Patrick Leahy on judicial nominations, I was the chief counsel on noms. I tried my best to try to keep John Roberts off of the D.C. Circuit, because it was clear from his record, as you said, Ian, that his primary work was as a political activist, as a right-wing activist, that he had very hardened views about some issues, obviously including the Voting Rights Act and more. And after I left the Judiciary Committee, he was nominated to the Supreme Court. And, he famously flashed his smile and said that he was just going to be an umpire and call balls and strikes. That was never true. Wasn't true then, not true now. He's someone who the Roberts Court has really orchestrated this attack on our democracy through these judicial decisions on Citizens United and also on the Voting Rights Act and also on redistricting and more. I just think we have a real crisis on our hands with this court. And as you point out, the hearings do not really illuminate in some ways what's really happening. I think Senator Whitehouse did a tremendous job during the Amy Coney Barrett hearings to uncloak this dark money swirling around the court, where these billionaire-funded groups are submitting amicus briefs, legal briefs to the Supreme Court, and this Supreme Court can choose its entire caseload. It doesn't have to take any of these cases. It has discretion. The majority, John Roberts' majority, has the discretion to choose which cases it wants to decide on, and it's choosing cases to undermine our democracy, like the Citizens United decision, which should be called Billionaires United, and the voting rights decisions of 2013, and the recent one that was written by Samuel Alito. This court is extreme, reactionary, and poised to reverse a whole array of precedents, like Roe versus Wade, that people rely upon, but much more than that. And I'm hoping, I guess my hope against hope, Ian, is that as these decisions come down with these Trump appointees in their first full term, that this will be the beginning of the end of this right-wing domination of this court, that the people will really react to these extreme decisions, this dramatic effort to reverse precedent, and that we will be able to use these horrible decisions as fuel to, re-energize our democracy and regain momentum toward the progress that most Americans support.
And again, I'm speaking with Lisa Graves, who's Executive Director of the new corporate watchdog group True North Research. She has served as a senior advisor in all three branches of the federal government, as Deputy Assistant Attorney General in the Justice Department, as Chief Counsel for Nominations on the Senate Judiciary Committee, and as a Deputy Chief of the Article 3 Judges Division for the U.S. Courts. And she has a report at In the Public Interest, the billionaires behind efforts to kill the U.S. Postal Service, and an article at Common Dreams, 12 years after Citizens United, the Supreme Court's right-wing revolution continues. So perhaps the worst decision in a way, and obviously nothing could be worse than Citizens United, but an equally bad decision, it just came down against OSHA's ability to mandate vaccines in and other protections against COVID in private workplaces. And that could lead to the undoing of all government rulemaking, where the expertise in OSHA and the Environmental Protection Agency and the Securities and Exchange Commission, you name it, across the board, that could all be wiped away and replaced by the whims and dogma of a right-wing judge.
You are so right, Ian. Spot on, because that decision basically says, in a nutshell, that the federal agency devoted to the health of workers in the workplace cannot issue regulations to protect the health of workers in the workplace if they're also threatened by that same affliction outside the workplace. What that means in reality is like smoking rules. People smoke outside the workplace. And so therefore, should we not be able to have rules to prevent smoking in the workplace when it's manifestly dangerous and has been proven to cause cancer? Of course, OSHA should be able to regulate that, but not according to the logic, or rather the illogic, of this Supreme Court, this results-oriented court that was handpicked to enact what Leonard Leo called a revival, quote, revival of his view of the Constitution as it existed basically 100 years ago, to kind of roll back all these precedents that allow the federal government to have agency rules and agencies like the EPA regulating carbon and more. And so this is a radical reactionary court, and it was handpicked for that reason. Leonard Leo has had a hand in all of these appointments except for Thomas. I think Leo was in law school at the time, but all of the others have been part of this effort to basically remake the court so that it will be poised to reverse a century of laws that have really helped define American progress and that have breathed real life into the promises of the Constitution that had been neglected or broken by previous courts. One of the things Chief Justice Roberts did at the end of this year was make this announcement about how, it's unfair to call the court partisan or these judges partisan, and that they're really independent despite all evidence to the contrary. And he pointed to Justice William Taft, former Chief Justice William Taft, who was also a former president, as someone who was responding to claims that the court was biased when it wasn't. Well, the court he's pointing to is the Lochner Court, the Supreme Court in a period when it was notoriously striking down progressive legislation on the workplace hours, workplace conditions, in favor of robber barons and big industry. That's who Taft was, and that's who Roberts is lionizing. And so we can see where this is going, and we must resist it. We must fight back against it, organize against it, and overcome it.
Well, I've been saying for the longest time about Leo, that what I find appalling is that this peculiar character who's a member of Opus Dei, which is an extreme conservative Catholic secretive sect that doesn't even announce who its members are, and there's a whole network of these Opus Dei people in the Trump administration across the board, and we could name them if you like, but Selden Whitehouse did at a hearing try to point out the enormous disproportionate power this one man has with his dark money, that he's got 5 of these 6 conservative right-wing justices on the court. They're all handpicked by him. He doesn't represent diversity in America. He doesn't represent diversity in the Catholic Church itself. How could we end up with such a narrow view of society, of religion, of the law, with this one man who's had such extraordinary success at the expense of American diversity?
It really is astonishing. It was particularly astonishing during the Trump administration because he was a, quote, volunteer for Trump, picking the slate that Trump was choosing from for the Supreme Court. Meanwhile, according to public records, he paid off his mortgage way early on his home the year, basically after Brett Kavanaugh was nominated, and he bought a mansion in Maine. On the day that the Senate decided to move forward with the vote on Brett Kavanaugh's nomination. And he, his sources of income are just not known because he wasn't subject to federal disclosure rules that an employee of the White House or of the government would have been required to disclose, where his sources of money were coming from. And so, he's clearly gotten wealthier, in part due to his role within helping to choose, not just choose who goes on the bench, but also helping to direct money to groups that are trying to push those judges or those judicial nominees toward confirmation. After the Washington Post exposed his network of dark money groups that were instrumental in backstopping Neil Gorsuch and Brett Kavanaugh for their appointments to the Supreme Court, after that article came out, he left his employment position at the Federalist Society to basically make it more visible what he was doing, in essence, which was to be an advisor to donors about where they should send their money. And he works now for a private, secretive, for-profit firm that he created with one of his buddies that has been instrumental in these judicial nominations fights. And the amount of money that they're raising for the private firm is unknown. They also, Leo also is connected to a couple of nonprofit groups that distribute money. It's distributed major money to the Republican Attorneys General and to the Republican State Leadership Conference, which helps try to install more right-wing judges on the state Supreme Courts, in addition to helping to get Republicans elected to state offices. And so you have both a for-profit and nonprofit operation that Leo is orchestrating. And right now he's sitting with a Supreme Court, or sitting, on the outside as an insider with so many of the justices on the Supreme Court that he helped get their offices. In Leonard Leo's office at the Federalist Society before he left it was a photograph of him and Brett Kavanaugh. And that photograph said, "Who's the boss?"
Wow.
Leo or Brett Kavanaugh. Similarly,
Right.
At a meeting of the Federal Society that was held the month that Brett Kavanaugh's nomination was pending before the United States Senate, Justice Thomas had a event with Leonard Leo in which Justice Thomas joked that he was there with the third most powerful man in the U.S., Leonard Leo.
Well, there you have it. And of course, most of his activities would not have been possible but for Citizens United, because he operates with dark money, which is a product resulting from that disastrous ruling. I'm afraid we've run out of time, Lisa. I want to talk to you about the billionaire behind efforts to kill the U.S. Postal Service, but we're going to be talking later in the program about deregulation in this country, so we'll cover it to some extent. So I thank you for joining us. I appreciate it.
It's always a pleasure to be on your show, Ian, anytime. Thank you so much for inviting me.
And again, I've been speaking with Lisa Graves, as Executive Director of the new corporate watchdog group True North Research. She has served as a senior advisor in all three branches of the federal government, as Deputy Assistant Attorney General in the Justice Department, as Chief Counsel for nominations on the Senate Judiciary Committee, and as a Deputy Chief of the Article 3 Judges Division for the U.S. Courts. And she has a report at In the Public Interest, the billionaire behind efforts to kill the U.S. Postal Service, and an article at Common Dreams, 12 years after Citizens United, the Supreme Court's right-wing revolution continues. We're going to take a brief station break. We're back speaking with the New York Times' global economic correspondent, whose new book just out is Davos Man, How the Billionaires Devoured